Hello, fellow ear opener listeners. Welcome to today's podcast, where we will be talking about what decolonisation looks like in music. My name is Jennifer, but some of you may know me as Damsel Elysium. I am a sound and visual artist working with string instruments and field recordings. However, describing myself as such hadn't come easy. My journey in music started with a deep childish passion and intensity, which over the years slowly dissolved into endless rejection, disappointment, and chronic pain. After a few years, I began to question why this had happened, beginning my research and hearing others that had a similar path to mine. At the age of 6, still in awe of the ever-growing world, I wanted to be a violinist. Eyes glued onto our tiny telly, face inches from the screen, I remember the pixels of bows and wooden bodies dancing subtly on the necks of men and women. I studied the devotion, the movement and sonorous expression from the string players at the BBC proms. I used to listen to my mother's 101 classics on repeat. Tchaikovsky was my favourite, although I couldn't really spell his name correctly. I was eager to be part of that romantic world. I did have the privilege to explore this imminent passion when my family funded my first violin, bought in Muswell Hill. My mother tells me how I pranced out of the shop and down the street with my new case, proud as a peacock, she says, oblivious to class or race at that time. And at that age, the only thing that mattered to me was the violin. That's all I wanted to do. And while I was constantly praised for my harmonious tone, my musical and lyrical expression, and my good ear, I struggled to read music quickly as the other children could. At the time, I didn't know I was dyslexic. Studying music theory made me lose confidence in my musical ability. Music theory is a useful skill, but one that is often portrayed as more critical than the music itself. I was only one of 3 black children in my youth orchestra. I was surrounded by middle-class children who, to me, didn't seem like they were excited by music and attended the orchestra like a sport. And as I progressed through the grades, I started to lose the love for the instrument and for myself. I stopped playing when I was 15 years old and had a neck injury from playing, and eventually a deep hatred for the violin. It was November 2019 when I decided to do some research into alternative music and discovered so many string players who were breaking the fourth wall, who were using classical instruments in an interesting way. And I started to realize something, that my passion for music hadn't died. It was that it was taken from me. And over time, during the first lockdown, I started to question the musical structures that I was put under, and realized how much elitism and racism existed within my experience. But I don't wish to ponder on the past too much, otherwise we'll be here all day. In the last 2 or 3 years and the rise of internet advocacy, it's not possible not to know that colonial rule still lives with us today and hides in the structures of pretty much every establishment, west and east, north and south. So I needn't go into too much detail. However, we will be covering what colonial structures have impacted on our current community, the music industry, and music education. I spoke to 5 music-involved artists from different parts of the industry who have all been doing work in reformation of music, whether through establishments, music itself, advocacy, or in their own musical practices. They all have very differing thoughts around this topic, but by the end of the conversation, we all had a very similar conclusion on the next step. I'm joined by Gary Crosby, who is the co-founder and artistic director of Tomorrow's Warriors, as well as being a jazz double bassist.
I'm Gary Crosby. I'm actually Dr. Gary Crosby, now OBE. I'm 67.
Kayleigh Miller, who is a violist, movement instructor, and music blogger advocating for musicians' health.
So my name is Kayleigh Miller, and I am primarily a classical violist, and I am based in the Pacific Northwest of the US. So I actually live in both Seattle and Portland right now.
Sarah Daramy-Williams, a violinist, violist, and composer.
The main things I do at the moment is, being a freelance musician, and that goes from the numerous different varieties of gigs that are in London, and it's taken me from the Baroque style to the popular sort of music that we call pop, and as well as the session work. So I am involved in a lot of cinematic work.
Elijah TC, a DJ, writer, manager, as well as being involved in the London grime scene.
Yeah, so my name's Elijah. I'm based in East London, like born and bred. I guess like most people know me now as a writer, but I'm a DJ, and my primary kind of day-to-day operations are as an artist manager. I kind of started out in the grime scene and started a label called Butters. Ran like hundreds of parties across the world in the 2010s. I tweeted the other day like I'm a trial and error artist. So I'm just trying stuff out.
And finally, Lucinda Chua, a singer-songwriter who uses and merges cello and electronics.
My name's Lucinda Chua. I'm an artist working with music and performance. I'm a singer-songwriter and my primary instrument is the cello. And I'm interested in exploring the intersection between the sounds of the past and the future. So I use classical instruments, but kind of fuse them with electronic production techniques.
Part 1. Colonial Impact in the Music World. A dive into the history of music will show how apparent colonization has impacted the structures of music and the industry. This can be seen through a lack of diverse representation in certain music spaces, the lack of funding or criminalization in specific music groups, how music is taught in schools, and how a large majority of music students all seem to have similar problems with their teachers, and how high level of elitism, racism, and sexism still perpetuates in musical spaces.
I was fortunate enough to do some teaching programs in Africa, and it was really interesting to really see colonialism in action, because a lot of the perspectives of American NGOs is to like bring classical music to these different populations. And to me, it was a rewarding experience to meet people, but it felt like a really missed opportunity sometimes to honor the cultures of the countries at hand. And that was really interesting because I couldn't really do anything about it. But so lots of different things and ways that spills over into American classical music culture, as well as American symphony culture and education and things like that.
And it's so funny because like it should be about music, but it was more about everything surrounding music, and noticing how I had to change myself and conform into a certain person and forget my identity. Even like my accents, I think many musicians can relate to being able to change and adapt to things. And I would constantly adapt myself, the way I speak, the way I sit, everything. So I think that was really hard to see that I was losing my own sense of self in the space that should be the safest, because it's where your expression is.
And then I was too slow at making beats, I guess. But I thought I could add something to the DJing landscape, and then putting on parties, I thought was like a good addition, because grime struggled with the ability to do that, because the police would like not allow all kinds of parties to happen. They had the form called 696, which meant that you had to like detail the races of people that would come and the type of music that you would play. And so in London, it stifled the scene for a long time until that form was scrapped. And at the same time, the music had a resurgence, another kind of wave in the mid tens, and I got to be a part of that, like with Skepta and Kayleigh and people that have become household names. But I was DJing in that scene for a long time before that happened.
I got involved in the whole scenarios of the late 60s and the 70s and became quite, I would just say, politicized, yeah. Involved in the Rasta movement, Black Power, and things like that. And I'm not blaming that period, but I think it took my mind away from art and music for maybe a decade or so, because those were pressing issues in the 60s, half of, 67, 1970, a good third of Africa was still under colonial rule.
When I went into the classical world, I didn't want to admit that this is the case. So I was definitely trying to hide the reality of things from myself. Also because the classical scene has this way of glamorizing things and making them look better than they are. So I was definitely going along with that. And it didn't make sense why I shouldn't fit in if I have such a good match with the violin. Because just separating everything else and just isolating me and my violin, I felt like it was perfect. Like if I had emotions, play there. It feels great. It felt great, to see I can create this beautiful music. But even beyond that, I can express myself. It's just so simple. It's the structure of how this is all run that doesn't make sense. And I think we all know that it's not right. But because it feels like there isn't any other option out there, we end up sort of surrendering to there. And especially the pressure of you should go through this route. You should go through music college and then you've made it. Or this is where the opportunity is. And it's still being taught to this day that this is the route to take. In terms of taking this route, there have been some regrets. A part of me has always been aware that this was wrong for me because pain already started manifesting itself at a few years in already into playing the violin. But I could, as a young child, I could bulldoze all the time, just force my way through and have this determination about me, especially taking on my mum's experiences and just going for it. But at the same time, I've learned so much from this, and it's part of my motivation for wanting to change things. I don't know if I would have had this same fire to change how things have been structured and built if I didn't go through it.
Part 2. Representation and Cultural Appropriation. Representation often seems to be the leading argument I read about in relation to musical spaces. Classical spaces not having a diverse group of players or program, the gender disproportion of higher-ranking roles in the music industry such as record labels, publishers and tour management, or music education not presenting an array of music from different cultures or countries. Should the argument really be about the race of the composer? When there is a clear disproportion of white composers from the past and present, one can only question, where are all the black composers? Where are all the women and all the others that don't fit the white middle-class male mold? One may simply dismiss that maybe they just didn't exist.
Because oftentimes it can be like, Miss, why is it like this? And it's like, shush. And then your curiosity slowly gets diminished. But that curiosity is where creation is made. So to listen to what is being questioned and maybe explore that a bit, I mean, I'm sure many kids have asked, like, why aren't there any black people in classical music? And then it's like, oh, awkward. But literally, like, we should think about that. Why aren't there many females represented? Or, like, make space for every person, every type of person to fit into.
I still have an Afrocentric interest in terms of how, when I want to present my art, yes, there are things I will draw from the continent and so on and so forth. But I no longer use the term black music, or, music is music. And why would I have to, I don't have to prove to anybody that this is a black music. I know. So I don't have to bother with it. It's those that are insecure about owning something that constantly have to keep reminding themselves.
The hardship and impact of white supremacy on the global majority did place barriers on the community, but not always in the way one would imagine.
All music is presented the same way, but if you expect somebody else to present your music in the way you would, then obviously you're at a disadvantage, because then it's dependent upon how that person sees your music, So instead of black people complaining about how the music has been presented, present it yourself, how you want it to be presented, because you're the one that has the information. You can't actually go to somebody who doesn't give a damn about you historically, financially, or culturally, and expect them to present it in a way that's favourable to you. This is the victim, I am the victim situation again.
Joseph Bologne, knighted Chevalier de Saint-Georges, was a prodigy composer and violinist of the 18th century. The son of an enslaved African, he became the most accomplished man in Europe, according to US President John Adams, now referred to as the Black Mozart, despite Mozart himself taking direct influence from the man. There is many examples of cultural appropriation in supposed Western musical works, some being perhaps innocent, where out of the influences of the times. For example, Debussy being influenced by ragtime, the precursor to jazz. But it is important to note that this is a form of colonization. Is it that there were no composers of colour to exist, or that actually their history was made invisible because it did not fit the status quo?
Well, the truth is that the model is not in one plane. There is the classical world and how it presents itself and how it may look on the other musics, whether through snobbery or even acceptance sometimes. But within the black world, we have our own greats. And the problem with most of the black people that engage in classical music, because of the inferiority complex that they have on a political and social level, they've brought it over into music. Damn, have they not heard Duke Ellington?
The invention of genre and categorization has meant that the terms black music or world music have been birthed. In some ways, this has opened up an avenue for music away from Western standard to peek through and spread its wings. But it also means that along with it, appropriation has become a major problem because the history of that music has not grown with it. For example, rock starting as an underground or minority genre of music started by black artists such as Chuck Berry and Little Richard, pioneers of rock and roll. But it's artists like Elvis Presley, the Rolling Stones, and countless more who reign supreme, or people believing techno began in Berlin, which stays present in people's minds, giving little credit to the black scene in Detroit.
Yeah, or I don't think we had that language. We didn't realize what we were doing. So there wasn't that language of decolonizing or barriers or anything like that. We're just doing what made sense to us, and by virtue of just doing it, then you realize, okay, to someone else, it has a bigger meaning, or so it's like, or even when you're in it, like, you know, okay, I'm trying to maybe change what this is, but we just didn't use that language. But yeah, part of the actual story of that music is the breaking down of barriers. So that if there was no barrier, then the music wouldn't even exist in the first place.
Cultural appropriation of music from around the world has been the recurring story of music becoming popular. History of the form and dismissal of the group's influence has caused this ripple in representation.
The other part of it is not acknowledging that many of the cultures of the United States that are not white have incredibly rich cultures that are worth exploring and learning about. And of course, folks do that within their own schools, especially elementary schools. But it's like, I think sometimes classical musicians don't acknowledge that, like, other countries have music that's worth learning about. And this is just one of many forms of music. And collaboration with other genres and other artists is also valuable. So that's another part that's missing for me.
Ahmad Jamal is one of the greatest pianists of all time. From an article in the Los Angeles paper, it reads, Jamal for many years has been proposing that jazz simply be known as American classical music. Two questions immediately arise: how to distinguish between jazz players and Copeland, Damrosch, Ives, Sessions and others? How to separate the improvisational essence of jazz from the fact that so-called classical music is completely notated and played as written? Jamal has a ready answer. Bach was always an improviser. You can put Aaron Copland and our music under the heading of American classical music. The only difference is that Copland is a peach tree and Ellington is a plum tree. It's just a difference in styles. Techniques themselves, such as improvisation, have been thoroughly disregarded in education of music in the modern West, where notation, harmony and theory are pushed, improvisation, rhythm and the use of the ear is discarded. I now use improvisation and the use of my ear as the main tools in my work, but sometimes bubbling under me there is a quiet angst to notate or add this type of form to my work. But even the likes of Bach and Handel left room for improvisation, which seems to be left out of the conversation. Baroque and early music saw notation as a way of recording, not necessarily for the purpose of instructions. The player was able to use it as a guide and interpret it in their own way. Jamal continues in the article, the personal touch of a Horowitz is not written on paper. Some of the readings classical players give are terrible compared to that given by others. In fact, certain artists can get more out of their own interpretation of Mozart or Beethoven than composers did themselves. So far as I'm concerned, that's another aspect of improvisation. Music theory is a tool, but has been made a mandatory part of composing throughout my education. In other cultures around the world, education of this form is not always the way.
But I would also like, in general, I would like the classical music world to ditch the white savior situation, which is a huge issue with, like, we're bringing Mozart to a whole Hispanic community and this is amazing, as opposed to, like, let's talk about how rich their culture is and the experience that they have, and this is another form of music, but it's all valid and important. And, like, I think some orchestras do that well, some cities do that well, some people don't. I think a lot of experiences don't, and they stick to that kind of drive-by, like, one-off thing that doesn't really have long-term ramifications.
From the autobiographical book by trumpeter and inventor of Fourth World music, John Hassell, he states, in the same way, classical or formal music in the West takes place in an atmosphere of reverence governed by rules of etiquette. In Euro culture, no form in which improvisation is a major element is considered classical, while in most other parts of the world, the high musical experiences are always those in which some response to the feeling of the moment is included. Furthermore, Western thought habits dictate that anything that is overtly sensuous with certain rhythmic inflections is automatically perceived as belonging on a lower rung of the cultural ladder, brackets, jazz, rock, pop, and so on. Obviously, what we have here is a kind of cultural racism that reduces non-European derived art to a curo status and thus neatly dismisses it from serious consideration in the same rank as our Western masters, all whom, it may be pointed out, are white, born in the last 300 years and from cold climates. I will also read an excerpt from a tribute to Benjamin Britten on his 50th birthday, where Imogen Holst, a composer who contributed a huge amount of work to Britten's pieces, talks of her time in India. She goes on, "When my Indian friends in Western Bengal heard that I was only staying 2 months in their country, they were dismayed. It would be impossible, they assured me, to learn anything about their music in such a short time. In India, lessons move slowly. The music course at University of Benares takes 9 years to complete, and I was told that an American musicologist on a year's traveling fellowship had left in protest after the first 4 months because he was still being taught the same tune." Holst continues, "In European music, phrasing helps intonation. In India, expression and intonation are one and the same thing." Further on, she says, "It was in Benares that I first began to recognize microtonal intervals by their sung expression. As a guest of the university, I was allowed to sit at the feet of the great singer Pandit Thakur. Pandit Thakur was what we should call a composer, but in India there is no difference between composer and performer. There are no written notes for the unique improvisation that follows the traditional setting of a raga. Every composer has to be a performer, and every performer has to be a composer." Back to atmospherics, John Hassel had spent his time in India learning from Indian classical singer Pandit Prannath, where he mentions listening to Pandit Prannath sing a centuries-old composition in the raga Darbari, a composition never written down but passed on from voice to voice. Part 3. Capitalism, Commercialism, and Health. My early experience has been vastly influenced by the classical world, but as I move with my work, I have suddenly been exposed to the complicated world of the music industry. Record labels, publishers, PR, and all of that. And for those listening who aren't involved in classical music, wondering how colonization presents itself, one must recognize that capitalism is the evolvement of colonization.
As for the young people today, you're caught in a world of hyper-capitalism. And even normal capitalism is all about profit and all about, making money and deceiving you to get that money. So now we're in hyper-capitalism. So there's hyper tricks to get you to part with your money, and the trinkets they're offering you are even less valuable than what they were when 200 years ago or 300 years ago when they come and stole the land. Build your own industry, which we have. We've built Motown. We built quite a few other, I can mention quite a few jazz artists who have started their own record labels, Quincy Jones and so on and so forth. But the same thing happens each time. Money. We sell it for money. Along that path, we then went from the Jazz Caf, because this has never been a money-making exercise for me, because if it becomes a money-making exercise, that means I have to charge people. And then those working-class black kids that I grew up amongst, they're not going to be able to afford it. And that's the same reason why that gap between the black community and art happened anyway in the first place. It's a matter of money. If you're a family man with a young child, what's more important? Going to watch a concert at Royal Albert Hall or putting food on the table? As my dad said, learn how to make people dance. Learn how to play at the local community centre. Learn how to play. And then I realised that this is what the history of black music is. It's a communal thing. When it meets with the commercial world, that's when the problem starts. But I'm part of the commercial world as well, so I'm not going to knock it. I earn money off of it. But I have to see how its function has been exploited and where it's been focused on. It's been focused on shake your booty.
A young musician starting out today might hope that social media and the ability to promote yourself might offer an escape from the commercial history of music making. But not only do we have a colonial past, we also have a colonial present. How does this affect mental and physical health of a musician? On social media and the constant bombardment of information, photos, and new music releases every day can be overwhelming and pressurizing for a growing artist. I have heard so much anxiety from fellow musician friends about how they should present online, seeing others doing so much more than them and their audiences expecting content from them constantly, to the point where it feels their creativity feels stunted, or that they can only make a living by being governed by TikTok or Instagram engagement. I, for one, know that 90% of my freelance work comes from Instagram and feel the need to be on it all the time in order not to miss opportunities. And sometimes knowing that you are the token in the industry can often make you feel like a target for large institutional platforms to use you commercially. These companies, platforms, and clients are all built from the successes of colonization and capitalism. The disproportion of wealth in the industry means that the underprivileged and marginalized artists are reliant on these social vehicles to survive and be noticed, and usually with unsupported, unguided, and unsustainable practices that deeply affect the mental health of the artists. Even big artists have been vocal for decades on how the music industry is so obscenely neglectful of artists on tour, financially, or just their overall well-being. On the physical side, Sarah, Kayleigh, and I discussed the seemingly everlasting physical pain that manifests in the body from such an early age from playing classical instruments. I carry pain in my back and shoulders from playing with tension and anxiety throughout my younger years. It's something that I have difficulty to this day. It was unnoticed and overlooked by teachers for years. That pain was part of the practice. Carrying the unconscious burdens of family or colleagues, carrying shame and anxiety that is often ingrained by teachers, orchestra, and the environment in the body causes chronic somatic pain. I had only realized this through working with Sarah, who had very similar issues to me, but had been on a journey of discovering that and rectifying it. Kayleigh, as a movement trainer, had also been exploring working with musicians in workshops and classes in their physical and mental health, and how so tightly interlinked these actually are.
This developing rigidity inside of me was manifesting as chronic pain or somatic pain. And the themes within there was even how I move physically, how I express myself, if I make a sound even. Like, because I would notice that I would want to make a noise sometimes when I'm trying to create a certain emotion within the violin, but I felt like, no, this isn't right. You're meant to just be the servant to the violin. Like your body almost is the instrument and the violin is the person.
So if we are going to change the health environment for musicians, I think it needs to start with teachers understanding more about humans, human bodies, wellness, things like that. I think we also need teachers, especially this is an old school idea, that the more you play, you're going to be in pain. It's just inevitable. And I think that's something that needs to go. And I think we need teachers to stop dismissing their students' experience of physical pain. And even if you as a teacher don't have the tools to solve it, talk to a physical therapist, know the other teachers in town who do. Like, I think teachers should have more skills in their toolbox, but I think also just knowing that if you can't help someone with something, you should encourage them to get help. From the psychological point of view, I think teachers just don't know that much. When we think of private education for music, it's usually someone, but not always, that has a degree in music. And a degree in music means that you've generally never taken any psychology classes. You maybe took an education course, maybe not. So teachers don't really understand mental health. They don't really understand physical health. And I think that's a huge gap, because students are under a lot of pressure. Even if their music environment isn't super stressful, their academic environment might be very stressful. The school environment, there's so many other aspects that are impacting students. And I think private music educators don't usually understand that. And then they may have really unreasonable expectations for their students.
Part 4, Education of Music. I think with all of this in play, it can be hard to focus on what we can do to rectify any of this, especially when it's something that has been rooted in our structures for hundreds of years. It can feel overwhelming, and one may feel the need to avoid it. Personally, I think having this dialogue now is a great step, but one area I think is crucial to talk about is the education of music. This is where everything begins. It's where the student learns what is right and wrong and what should be taken into their future. Whether they are a composer, producer, or musician, part of a band or orchestra, or even a soloist. Some children can be put off early on because of the pressures of teaching, and the elitist ideas of music begin to be ingrained. But also, one thing to mention is that many young artists, composers, and musicians often come out of education unaware of the industry's confusing and often trickful nature when it comes to contracts, royalties, and pay. How to have a sustainable career in music or to look after one's health is not a popular topic. When speaking to my guests, I asked about what their education in music was like and how it affected them. For me, as a neurodivergent individual who did not know at the time of my learning, I ended up with a lot of anxieties and trauma. I couldn't understand why I seemed not to get things straight away, and that my peers were able to fly through the grades, or why teachers and conductors were so impatient with me and didn't recognize that I didn't understand certain things. I would begin to zone out in lessons and nod blankly, pretending that I understood the theory I was being recited, or put my bow softly on the string, playing mute in the youth orchestra, because I was so overwhelmed with fear getting the notes right. Sight reading baffled me, and I would end up improvising in the middle of a piece. There was stress to get things perfectly correct in such a small amount of time, not noticing that their teaching style may have been the problem. And of course, at such a young age, the elders were to be seen as always correct, that I was wrong. Looking back, and also working with Sarah this year, I've realized I simply needed an alternative way to learn. The guests I speak to also offer solutions to the current flaws in the framework of education. Gary Crosby also speaks about how Tomorrow's Warriors works as a framework for music education. And some of these ideas may appear radical or just obvious to integrate. But however you may interpret these ideas, one thing was very clear to me. the education system is entirely outdated and that this should be where we start the decolonizing work.
But in previous aspects of my life, I started on violin as a little kid, and I always enjoyed violin, but I was never like on this like fast prodigy track, just like a normal kid taking lessons and enjoying it. And in high school, I really enjoyed youth orchestra and enjoyed concerts, and that was kind of where the moment clicked where I wanted to do it professionally. And along the way, I had some great teachers and I had some not so great teachers. And I think that's part of what has shaped my perspective on pedagogy and the way that we teach. I've also had different experiences with different populations in terms of teaching. So I worked with folks with autism or on the autism spectrum throughout my grad school experience, teaching them music lessons, as well as folks with other disabilities, and that was really interesting. As well as doing a longer music residency program in a pediatric psych unit, so working with folks with eating disorders, self-harm, things like that, and who are not necessarily musicians, but finding ways to integrate music into their treatment and into their programming, which was really interesting. So many different things kind of along the way that have shaped my perspective as both a normal person and a musician, as well as seeing some things that are not great.
The age of whatever, 10. I'm gonna start that again. I was like, age doesn't matter, Sarah. Why are you still using age? I began when I was 10. And I came from a very musical family. My mum studied and was a pianist, and she wanted all of us to learn an instrument and go actually directly within the classical scene. And it's a funny way because I realize I'm very competitive. My brother picked up the violin before me, and I was sort of aware of that. I think someone must have told me that like he quit or something, and then I decided to try it. And I considered that like already a victory because he quit and I just kept going, and I was like, actually, I like it as well. So I went on from there. And I think it was the right match for me. I don't think I've ever had like questions about whether I should have had another instrument because I felt so emotionally connected to the violin.
Started an interest in music at a very young age, but I didn't really get serious about music until mid to late teens. The first instrument I really engaged with was trumpet, although I had engaged with literally all the instruments in a ad hoc way or a family gathering way or a community centre type vibe. But the first instrument I took serious was the trumpet. And then I met a great teacher before I started playing, as soon as I started playing double bass, I met a teacher called Peter Ind, a great bass player who studied here, went to America in the 40s, played with all the greats, came back here in the late 60s, early 70s, and started the idea of jazz education in a informal sense, but within the formal environment.
I started on piano at 4 and I really didn't like it and I quit. So that was the first thing. I don't know whether I asked for piano or if my parents initiated it. I just don't remember. It was a long time ago. But I apparently asked for violin lessons and we waited until I was 6 to start that. And I think I was just jealous that somebody else in my class could play Mary Had a Little Lamb or something like that. And they played it at show and tell. But so that was like the beginning. And I was trained through Suzuki, which is both good and bad. I'm probably older than you. But in the context of Suzuki, what is good is there's lots of music that you listen to that kind of transfers over into your playing. But even as a little kid, it felt like there were lots of music that didn't show up there, which I like. I mean, we're talking the early 90s here, but almost all the music from Suzuki methodology, regardless of the instrument, it's pretty much like pre-1850. So I remember that being a big issue and like asking for all sorts of supplementary books, like asking for the Little Mermaid play along and like things like that. And the older I get, the more I realize that private lessons, especially with pretty young kids, should have more diverse music.
I started learning music at the age of 3 via a Japanese method called Suzuki. And it's a philosophy that teaches children to learn music as if it were a language. And there's a lot of emphasis on self-expression and group play and sharing music through performance, like concerts and group lessons, rather than via examinations or grades. And Suzuki teaches you to learn by ear and feeling rather than through reading sheet music. So definitely, like, as a result, I've struggled with reading music and understanding kind of Western music theory, but I've always been really confident in performing and improvising and expressing.
Yeah, I think institutions really need to think about, like, how this work is going to help people to go into the professional scene, number one, if you want to go into there, and how it can free up people to create and flourish the already existing scene. I would say it's more about balance than like killing the old tradition, because there is absolute beauty in it still, but it's just the way it's done. If there are any limitations, how can that be lifted? So I think turn it upside down a bit, like allow the students to choose how they want to be taught and make it possible. Because I think also teachers end up losing their joy because they're like, oh, I have to teach this now, and it's repeated over and over again. But I think places thrive when they're continually being developed. So allow the young voices to be heard. Maybe start there, I would say.
Like if a 6-year-old wants to play Twinkle Twinkle, but also wants to play the music of Encanto, it's totally fine and nobody cares. And I think we can get rid of some of that elitism early on, whether it's genre or composer. And my teacher at the time wasn't totally opposed to it, which is great. Like we were allowed to supplement to some degree. But now knowing, thousands of people who have trained in this, it's like it's missing so many things, both in terms of like where composers are from, but also from the last like 200 years of music. So I think that's one of the big issues with all the different methodologies. And I can't speak for the Royal Conservatory methodology books and all the testing, but I'm guessing it's probably the same, is that we're missing a lot of music. And I think that turns people off of classical music because it's not giving them music that they connect with. It's just putting them through a series of books to finish.
We believe is the only way you can actually teach jazz is people learn jazz, you don't teach them, you teach them some of the principles, but it's a solitary skill really that you have to learn through experimentation.
What do they call it? Like associated board exam pieces, for example, those structures, they should be guidelines. They shouldn't be achievements that you must make. They should be guidelines that help you to organize yourself and just to help you along the way to find what you want. But they shouldn't be things that you should aspire to achieve. When I was studying, I think I wanted a lot more exposure of what was happening in the external world. So to have a massive marrying of the professional scene and the studying scene, I'll call it. And to see how they can connect. Because the work I'm doing now, maybe half of it I didn't know I was going to be doing, or even realize that it was a possibility.
I think also in music education, we do need a shift, especially at that professional collegiate level, of teachers to move away from the old approach of teaching, which is a lot of binary thinking, wrong and right. We play this music, we do it this way, you're not doing it that way, you're not good. Like there's a lot of that, and I think it's starting to be left, but that needs to change. And I think that also means that you need to value the contributions of people of all different races and backgrounds and all different paths to classical music, and not just the 4-year-old prodigy that won all these competitions. So I think as a teacher, we need teachers that have, I think, a little bit more nuance in the way that they're teaching and are interested in supporting students of all backgrounds, economic classes, et cetera, regardless of who's going to make them look the best or who's going to win the biggest competition. But there's so many issues from teachers that comes back to the binary thinking of like, you're doing it wrong, teachers that yell at students, teachers that shame their students for making mistakes. Teachers don't understand that making mistakes is a necessary aspect of learning. Like, you literally have to make a mistake in order for the neurons in your brain to kind of like pay attention, fix things, identify the motor skills needed. It's just literally needed. So as a teacher, rather than shaming someone for playing a wrong note or playing out of tune, you say that it happened, you say it objectively, and like, how can we fix this? You know, do we need to write something in the music? How can I help you learn this, as opposed to you're doing it wrong, what's wrong with you? Which I think is definitely a mindset that a lot of people have experienced through music education over the last like 50 to 100 years.
You don't need your parents in that space. You don't need elders in that space. You need the one teacher that understands about this, what happens when young people who are in the same mindset get together, are given the tools and the opportunities to express themselves. They don't need you. They just need you once a week to come and teach them or show them some new techniques and all that. And that's what we discovered at the Warriors. And we operate with that policy of education and opportunities. So the education would be once a week. We run a workshop. You attend one of the workshops. We talk about music. We might teach some technical skills. We will play a little bit. But for the other 7 days of the week, you've got to listen to the records. Or we will fix up a gig for you so you can develop those skills that you're learning. And that's, Janine says from the cradle to the stage. She has this view. That's what we do. We support you from the cradle to the stage.
I think it's to listen and have a look at what's being created right now and implement that right now into the music curriculum. That's one thing I would say, because creation is being made everywhere, and why can't it be put into fundamental learning? Like, why is it alternative? Why can't we mix things up a bit and show everyone what is possible? And that could look like, supposing in graded exam books, not just putting in the usual Baroque piece, classical piece, jazzy, slightly edgy jazzy piece that's still classical and romantic, but instead maybe even adding, I don't know, Caribbean music, chant music, so medieval, like really just showing everything and letting the child decide what they want instead of you must do this. And that goes into my next point, which is have a look at what rules have been instilled and question them.
Finally, part 5, Individuality and Breaking the Mold. After hearing the thoughts from Gary, Sarah, Elijah, Kayleigh, and Lucinda, it was quite clear that a focus on restructuring the educational model and how we teach music to young people was high priority. But something else I found appearing in all the conversations was quite unifying, and it was also something that I had been thinking about abstractly in my own practice. It was the idea of self-reflection and approaching individuality.
Recently, I've been reflecting on my experience as a musician, particularly in relation to my identity as someone with mixed British, East and Southeast Asian heritage. I think maybe amongst the older generation, as people of colour, classical instruments, they were tools that allowed us to gain access to essentially white elite spaces that maybe wouldn't have accepted or welcomed us without them. And I think it's really important as the younger generation that we're mindful not to perpetuate this model minority myth, and that it's essential for us to learn how to respect and care for our whole selves, not just the parts that are praised for our talent or for our skill. There's definitely a lot to unpack in terms of how we find our own sense of self-validation and what success looks like to us, something that doesn't require us to self-erase or to assimilate. But for the most part, I think it's important for us to keep in our minds who our audience is and to hold tight to that. And the first step in decolonising the music industry is to decolonise our own minds. And I know that when I ever am faced with having to make a decision or to think about who I'm making the music for, I think about my younger self, someone who didn't have a role model to look up to, who looked like me. And I know that if I'm making work that would make that person proud, then I'm probably doing something right.
Social upliftment, all these things are very important to me as an artist, but nothing is more important than the art. The art is more important because without it, it means nothing. So that's important. It's important that the art is presented in a way that's genuine and we are professionals.
Producer and instrumentalist Control, spelled CKTRL, or also known as Bradley Miller, says this in a Harper's Bazaar interview titled, "Control wants to reimagine what we know as classical music." It's definitely an access thing, and for the people who do have the access, it's important to think about what's going to make me practice and see it through. I don't even think it's a thing of pushing or visibility. You just have to do it. Sometimes people look for validation from white establishment. I don't want that. Validation is obviously something that people see, but that's what cripples visibility, because as black artists, we are always going to get labelled as the black version of what we do. For example, right now, if you go online and look at the reviews of Robin, it will probably say it's all jazz, and I'm like, it's not actually much jazz happening, but okay. Most of the time, if you voice something, people are initially in opposition to it, but if you just go out there and be the thing you want, then it's forever. So for me, it's not necessarily about pushing back and making black classical more known. It's more that I would rather make it accessible to young black people who want to get into it. People like to say there's a London jazz scene, and there is, but I'm definitely not in it. Growing up, how I grew up, I know my purpose is different. There are always going to be people who want to learn instruments or want to read loads of music at the beginning in life. But there are also other kids who maybe that's not their story. They might not be that academic, or they might not necessarily hone it in on their craft when they start learning. I decided to show this quote from Control to Sarah, and here were her thoughts.
Really, for me, it made me reinstate that thought that people don't have the answer that you're looking for. You do. And as hard as it is to navigate yourself around any sector of life that you find yourself going into, you have the answer to that. And I think it's really beautiful that you said, like, just show it. Just show young black people what is there. Because it's really, that is literally saying you are the change. Rather than making change, you're just being change. And I completely agree there. I don't see myself as necessarily a victim for going through what I went through. Because in the end, it's all experiences, and it's what you do with it that sort of dictates whether it chains you or frees you up. So I do think that instead of being sort of tormented by what others are saying about you, you're creating how you want to be seen. There are many conversations, I'm sure, that come about boxes. I hate being in boxes so much that I literally imagine myself dodging them all the time like this because they're so limiting and I don't feel seen at all. But I also like exploring them and seeing how I would be if I were to be in that box. And then moving on from that box and then just seeing what happens. So I don't know what I mean by that, but there are always going to be boxes that are continually created by society and by people because we're trying to find safety in it subconsciously, I think.
I then asked Sarah if she had made any changes to her own craft and what was valuable from that experience.
If I answer that question, it has to begin with the internal changes. And I've started off by first finding out what all these rules and shoulds have been existing within me for all these years. And, well, in this case, the theme for me is somatic chronic pain. So listening to that, because that's been the element of, or it has been the answer that I've been looking for, which is just basically listen to myself and see what's going on in order to find out who I am, because I can easily drown myself in other people's identities and set of rules. So come back home to myself. And in terms of how I've changed my craft, well, the first thing I did was to completely stop practicing and to pick up my instrument whenever I want to, and to always start from how I'm feeling and not change that. So if I'm feeling tired or just heavy physically, play from there. If I'm feeling angry as hell, play from there. If I'm feeling whatever, depressed, play from there. And that's really shown that change is healthy, because my playing is like a shapeshifter. It changes all the time. How resonant I am in my body, in my violin, because of my body. How expressive I am. And, we are creating music with our bodies, so I've really learned to listen to what my body wants. And if I don't, then the amount of freedom I have in my vibrato is really limited, because I'm literally tense, so I'm only able to do a certain amount. So to surrender to the state of my being at all times, that's been a practice that I've been implementing.
And with the rise of individuality amongst artists and musicians, I asked Sarah, how does this independence play within the current landscape of the music industry?
White musicians that I've worked with, quite a few of them are miserable. So I don't know why I would seek validation from people that they're not the depiction of what I'm looking for either. And they can't be, because they're not me. So it wouldn't make any sense for me to go searching for people that are probably just as confused or even more confused as I've been. Yeah. Because I've had these conversations within her ensemble and individually with others. But personally, for me, stop fixating on the past, which is quite a big sentence to use, because it relates to so many other areas. But we have a tendency of worshipping the past, whether that's in the composers of the past and the rules that have been made. So tradition, in a way. And there's this quote that I love. I hope I can remember it. It's, tradition is peer pressure from dead people. I love that so much. This is not my own creation, unfortunately, so oh well.
Well, like, look, this thing is like not ever going to be in a place where, oh, everything works for artists now, everything's fine. It's just a constant adjustment with taste changing, with technology changing, and with the business and the fairness of it changing. So it's not, there isn't some like landing spot we can all get to and be like, okay, this is now a fair system for artists. I don't think that's ever going to happen. So it's something that you have to negotiate for yourself. And some people, I guess when we're talking about this in a broad sense, I guess that's what my work is trying to give people as much information as possible to make a decision for themselves individually. I don't think you can change the whole industry at the same time or make it a safer place or anything. I don't really believe that. I just think you can equip people to make better decisions. Before, people were signed to deliver 4 albums or 5 albums to Sony Music, so that's what they did. But now but most people are not in that position. So the kind of diversity of produce should reflect that. And try and push artists and push everyone I work with to not follow, careers of pre-internet artists, not follow careers of people that are not competing in the same landscape as you. And it does make a difference in terms of how people think about this thing. They go, James Brown didn't do this, or Stevie Wonder didn't do this. It's like, well, they're not competing today. So, and I think if James Brown was here now, he would use TikTok. I think and he would be good at it. You know what I'm saying? So I want to just remind artists, like, okay, even if you think, say, like, I'm trying to think of an introverted artist. Let's say Prince didn't use social media. That's like a fair example. But I'm like, okay, are you Prince? That's not your situation. So, like, what's the point in even using that anecdotally? You've got to find something that works for you, something that's comfortable for you to deliver and regular. Like, a lot of people think, oh yeah, I can just take a year off or 2 years off and then come back to it when I feel like it. And you can, but just expect things to be different when you come back every time.
The next generation of music is about coming out of institutions, out of establishments, or using only parts of it that are useful. Forming something new musically and finding solace and confidence within ourselves and our rich histories. By holding existing institutions and educational structures accountable, challenging them, and offering new ways of teaching and learning, and by continuing the discussion. It has been such a cathartic experience to share this journey with you, and a pleasure to share the discussions I had with my guests. I hope you find this a useful, educational, and reflective experience. I have linked my sources and some other resources part of my research in the description. I've also included links to the guests who appeared today. Please consider following them and supporting their work. I hope we can keep this momentum for change. Please feel free to continue the conversation in the comments, and please be respectful and kind. Thank you for listening.